Hi, and welcome to AHA, the coaching show. I'm Brian Fernandez, and today's topic is all about the buzzword AI and how that's going to impact our lives. Now, to bring an expert lens to the conversation, we have Taranjit Singh, the CEO of Quantum Step Advisory. Taranjit, great to have you on the show again.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, for a start, Taranjit, can you give us an overview of your background and your involvement in the coaching landscape?
Of course, it's a pleasure. So I'm a consultant. I started out in the Price Waterhouses of the world. Lots of work around the area of restructuring, corporate finance, management consulting, and in more recent years, the whole landscape on the national agenda, specifically how do we go out there to talk about lifting our game as a nation. I've had experiences both here in Malaysia as well as the region, and in recent years out in Central Asia, Brian. Within the coaching side, I'm a certified master coach with ICF. I've had this interest in coaching, and it's been a calling to some extent, especially when we deal with senior practitioners, senior leaders, CEOs, and board members right now. And within the AI space, it's something very close to my heart. I am a technologist by training. I grew up in the world of computer science and what have you, rather than IT as what we see it today. So registers and accumulators and what have you. And this particular space on AI is basically homecoming for me, because when I was growing up, the closest thing we got to this would be, those chatbots, the early chatbots, and looking at the reasoning behind how these chatbot works. And you now see what's playing out. You've got an entire army of these chatbots running around, giving very different permutations and productivity related stuff and the like. So yeah, exciting stuff, right? Totally exciting.
Okay, for a start now, um, how is it from our space really impacting HR, which has traditionally been quite conservative in terms of technology adoption?
Oh, very good question. Um, so where do we start? So HR, you're right, has been one of the slower parts of the organization to embrace AI. The closest, if I could say, without being disrespectful, the closest in the earlier days was if you're using an Excel sheet, you're almost there, if you know what I mean. But right now, there have been tremendous inroads being made from a productivity side. You've got lots of applications that are coming out, such as Juicebox, as an example, that talks about analytics. There's analytics now that's playing out. You don't need to be a data scientist as a HR practitioner. If you have the inquisitiveness, you can already start to enter into this particular space of analytics. If you talk about the area of end-to-end recruitment and selection, you've got outfits out there like Workable that is already focusing all the way from identifying people, getting them on board, amalgamating them, and then selection, putting them through their paces, and taking them out at the end by talking about onboarding. You've got also, from a coaching side, you've got Coach Hub as an example. We don't need professional coaches to the way that we used to. Coaching has now been democratized. The cost of coaching has now come down because I've opened it up to the world. Everyone has an access. If everybody can fly, everyone has access to coaches in this regard. So yeah, the entire system has changed. There has been a tumultuous, especially these last couple of years, a tumultuous tsunami of sorts that we are now experiencing. My
Okay,
question is, are we ready? That's my question. Are we ready to receive this?
okay, and you've brought up a couple of different issues that we need to unpack a little bit later in the show. But let's talk about readiness. Your last
Sure.
question around are we ready? And when you talk about are we ready, it's really around skill sets. What are the skill sets that we need in order to take advantage of this AI revolution?
Oh, absolutely. Okay, that's a big one there, Brian. Um, I think f- from a perspective of being naturally inquisitive, there is a desire to want to know more on how things work. HR by nature comes to the table as a I know it all because I am the custodian of all this data, as an example. But the point now comes in is actually it's no longer about the data, it's about how we use that data. It's no longer about the policies and procedures, but it's actually going out there and taking it to another level. It's no longer about KPIs in the old sense of the word, but it's now how do we effectively see that through from the top down to the nth level. So one thing that really comes across in my mind is the ability to analyze and analytically consider the options at hand. In the earlier days, when we go in for our MBAs or when we go in for the degrees that we are in, we are taught this is how organization behavior is, this is how organization design is, this is how. But right now, there are just so many changes that are taking place. All those frameworks are out of the window. I now have new things that I can use. I have new technologies that I can use. So you need to come to the table with the glass half full always. You need to also come to the table with a growth mindset. I'm constantly wanting to learn new things. But I think more importantly, also right now, there needs to be an ethical and moral compass that we have to come to the table with. Why? Because AI is doing all the stuff behind the scenes and there are innate biasness. You're only as good as the data sets. And we know, Brian, that the data sets are innately biased because of where they come from and the type of history that the data sets have. So, as HR practitioners, you need to come to the table with a level of ethical standards and the ability to come to the table with an unbiased viewpoint and not just depend on what the AI technology provides to you as possible answers.
Okay, I'm going to give a very quantifiable example to what you've just mentioned.
Sure.
Bias that creeps in. Now, one of the key areas where bias creeps in is in recruitment. So previously, when HR went from Excel to applicant tracking systems,
Yep.
what it was basically going, the promise was, oh, it's going to be, it's all rules based, we put in all these parameters, and then basically it's going to simplify our lives. Doesn't that sound familiar? That's what we're
Yep.
hearing today. However, inherent bias crept into the rules because essentially you're looking for people that probably found the 80% of the mold, and the 20% that fell out of that basically were potentially, and this happens a lot, the
Yep.
interesting candidates that never got shortlisted. Now,
Yep.
today, that's already happening with AI, with LinkedIn, for example. Well, a lot of candidates, and again, just as a disclaimer, I run for 23 years an executive search business, so this is something that's close to my heart. I'm getting a lot of feedback from middle and senior management uh, uh, um, uh, candidates that say that they've applied for a job on LinkedIn, and even though they're really qualified, they never get called back. They never get a response. And so that's why, I mean, I laugh and say, that's why I've always said at a senior level, and there will always be a place for the human element for the headhunter. And so that's
Absolutely.
really, Taranjit, an example. And the bias will creep in again in AI as you have your large language models, as you are putting in the data, bias will creep in.
Inevitably. I absolutely, and especially for something as sensitive as employees, nuances are very important. We have to understand and empathize, and there needs to be a feel. Now, where we talk about, and don't get me wrong, I mean, I'm using, a lot of my clients are using these technology platforms, and they're using it for productive related matters. I'm driving productivity. I'm now doing away with the tasks that we used to do because I can now automate those tasks. So, absolutely the right thing to do.
And
However,
Taranjit, can I stop you
yes,
then and just give
yes,
the
of course.
audience a really simple example of productivity gains? Think back even 5 years ago, how difficult it was to actually come up with a job description. To, Today, you come out in seconds. And then all it is a senior person looking through the job description, a hiring manager saying, no, this is not suitable, whatever. And then let's change this. And that's where the human interaction comes in and the human intervention comes in. The thought processes around maturity and things like that. But it leads me to the next question where essentially you make a lot of junior work redundant.
You're right. Now the question arises is, where are we as employees making ourselves relevant? So I don't call it redundancy. I actually call it, are you being relevant? Now, if there are platforms out there that are doing this and they're doing it very well, I must say, do I still need somebody like you to do this? And the answer is absolutely not, because I can. So we had in the earlier days, we had people who were custodians of job descriptions. That was their work. Their
And
entire focus was just to manage job descriptions. Well, hello, we don't need that anymore. And so the question now comes in is, are you, and this is a question I would like to leave, if there's one thing at all, what are you doing to make yourself relevant for the continuing sustainability of not only yourself, but also for the organization? And if there are platforms that are going to do this, sorry, you're no longer relevant.
so obviously and I think that's a universal perception that there is going to be a huge impact on jobs. But let's take your example of the HR department. And what will then happen is, if you're already automating the job description, so the person who used to do only the job description has to find his or her usefulness by then taking on other elements like recruitment and and maybe employee onboarding in order to stay on the job and be relevant. Taranjit, sorry, I think we have lost a connection with you.
I'm
Sorry,
here.
you're back on again. Yep.
I'm here. Go ahead,
Did
sir.
you?
I missed.
So you missed that. So I said, so essentially the person who was doing the job description has to now move on to doing things like job onboarding or recruitment. Otherwise, they are no longer required by the organization.
Yeah. So my point is here, and I'm seeing this playing out more and more. The value chain has now moved a little bit. Things that you were done, and I call it transactional related because you can automate it. That's now being looked at by machines and platforms and what have you. And there's nothing wrong with that. Those folks that used to do it now have to reinvent themselves by looking at other things. Now, actually, the question now comes in: are you of uh, a particular type of thinking that you see these things coming into play?
Mm.
Have you envisaged this change? Or are you quite comfortable doing the same thing over and over again? When the change comes in, it hits you quite badly. This is where the constant reinventing, the constant relearning, and we call it lifelong learning. This is actually where it comes into play, Brian. And it's not just for HR, it's for everyone. We were just having a conversation just before we started about the consulting arena, the
Correct.
number of job losses that are being experienced around the world from a consulting side. Where do these ex former big boys are now going to play in? Are they going to open up their own firms, or are they going to go up into some platforms that will now start to farm them out as body shops, as an example?
Yes.
So the world is changing. The world is changing rapidly, and I can do one or two things. I can either wait for it to happen to me, or I can be ahead of the curve. And I would rather be ahead of the curve, whichever the
No,
case that may be.
and which takes me now to really, this is the coaching show. What's the impact on coaching been for AI? What has the impact of AI been on coaching? I
In on
think one of the,
coaching.
yeah, and one of the key things I think first off the bat is the democratization of coaching. So coaching
Yes.
really has been, you're able to deliver the service electronically in a repeatable fashion to a far greater number of individuals, especially at the more entry level to middle level positions.
So you're right. And what I would go on to say is we are only seeing the first entry points of AI technologies in this. We have not talked about AR, augmented reality. We have not talked about the VR space, where we now have these goggles. And guess what? Lo and behold, I'm in a very different space virtually in this regard. But to your point around what does it look like, I do believe that as coaches, we need now to be technologically adept. We cannot ignore this wave that is before us. As much as we would like to, we cannot ignore it. So, the democratization is one example, but I also have other technological platforms, Coaching Hub and all this sort of stuff, Better Up and what have you, where there are, if we are not on the boat or we're not on the train has left, or we're not on the bus has left, because it is coming to that. So that's the first one. The other one is the ability to adapt. So there needs to be a constant uh, skill, and it is a skill to constantly adapt the service offerings. Because if I'm going to provide a service offering that an AI platform is able to provide at 24/7, basically, I need to do significantly different, not better, but differently compared to that platform in order for me to continue with this. We need to be also mindful about data and privacy. So that privacy of data, that integrity, that area of security is going to be quite crucial. Seeing all the data leaks that we have had in the past with Cambridge Analytica and what have you, if we are now playing with these sort of platforms, we have to be, or we are creating these platforms as coaches. And there are a couple of us around the table that are currently doing that. This area of data privacy, data integrity, data security cannot be underestimated. Lastly, I would imagine, Brian, the ability to scale up, but scaling up from a personalization perspective, because the AI has data, there is all this data that is relevant to only you and it's relevant to somebody else. We are now able to look at thematic analysis. The system is able to do that. As coaches, am I able to go out there to personalize, but at scale? Because that's what's going to be playing out when the platforms come to a head. Does that make
Okay,
sense, Brian?
that does make sense, but then I think that does makes less sense as you go further up the value chain from a coaching perspective. So what happens, for example, when you're coaching, you're a person that's coaching CEOs, C-suites, board members, and then maybe a level or two down. Now, at that sort of element, and when you're discussing with the CEO or the C-suite, you're coaching them, and they're going through a merger. They are talking about all the various moving parts around the merger with HR integration and so forth. It's a challenging thing. Yes, actually, one of the ways to use the tool is for you as the coach to do some research before the consulting engagement, maybe run through some AI scenarios with the tools to equip you better to deliver that personalized service to your coachee.
So I would agree with that, and you're absolutely spot on. As we move up the hierarchy, and it is a hierarchy that we're talking about, the personalization and that human element becomes even more pronounced. Why is that? Because the rules of the game now becomes very intense. We are playing at a very intense pace as we are moving up to C-suite or even to CEO and thereafter to shareholders of board. So the things that come into play off the bat, in my mind, would be emotional intelligence,
Mhm.
understanding the nuances that are playing out, managing the way people are thinking, what they are feeling, which platforms are not able to do, at least not now. The other one that comes across is complex solving problem, where we talk about problem solving with various dimensions, but from a humanistic perspective. I can come up with algorithms, but they're very mechanical. They're very
Correct.
mathematically oriented. But this is more humanistic. So there are priorities that I now have an intuitive feel from a coaching side, which a platform may not necessarily have. So that's the second one. The third one is relationship building. We build our approach based on trust. We are a trusted coach or a trusted advisor to these individuals. And that relationship is something which takes time and the ability to have that toing and froing and that conversation, which a platform may not necessarily have, at least not yet. And lastly, ethical standards. There will be, you mentioned, we are going through, as an example, you're going through the area of a transformation, or you're going through a merger, or you're going through a cutting down of people, whatever the case may be. There are ethical considerations that come to mind. It's not just a one and zero. There are other factors around compassionate areas, around
Mhm.
whether it is the right thing to do, which platforms, because of the algorithms that they're using, may not necessarily be able to provide that. So those are the three or four things that immediately comes to mind that differentiates as we go up the level of coaching.
Taranjit, it's been a fascinating conversation. This, I think, has shed light to and answered some questions which I think have been bothering coaches about how they're going to be impacted. But before we leave, any final thoughts you'd like to leave the audience with?
Of course. So it's coming, it's already here, this AI platforms as a whole. I would actually encourage, it's not a question of not being averse. I would actually encourage individual practitioners and coaches to open up and understand how it works. It is viewed not as a competitive tool, but it should be viewed as supplementing the approaches that you're using. So that's the first one. The second one that I would perhaps go on to emphasize, as I started out earlier, was the ability to come to the table with the desire and the childlike inquisitiveness to want to learn, because the environment is so different. And if I come to the table with a perspective of I know it all, which we used to, but the environment has changed, so I need to come to the table with some level of childlike inquisitiveness to say, I don't know what I don't know. How can I go out there to learn this? And the last one, Brian, is the innate, not only inquisitiveness, but the ability to understand the bigger picture, because the picture is changing all the time. And if we are only focused on one small thing, we miss out on the bigger picture, because you're just so focused on the pixel, you lose out on the picture, which is the
Picture.
larger. Yeah,
Absolutely. On that note, Taranjit, thank you very much for taking your time to be on the show.
it's my pleasure, Brian. It's an absolute delight being here. Thank you for having us.
Now, we've been speaking to Taranjit Singh, the CEO of Quantum Step Advisory. I'm Brian Fernandez, and you've been watching and listening to BizTech's Aha, the coaching show. Now, this interview will be on our website, www.biztech.asia, as well as our syndication partners, TV stations, radio stations, and websites. Thanks a lot for tuning in.